This lesson is on applying the point-slope formula. So last week we talked about slope-intercept form and how great it was and easy it was to graph a line in that form. What's difficult is when they ask us to write an equation in slope-intercept form or in standard form, and point-slope form is our way of doing this. So this is really not a way that you would ever keep your equation. This is a formula you would use to get to generally slope-intercept form. So M, of course, stands for slope, just as it did before. X1 and Y1 is a point that we are given. If we're given 2 points, we just choose one of those 2 points. So let's take a look at how we might use this. For this first question, we are given the slope. The slope is 5. And notice I've written the point-slope formula for you up here just as a reminder. So we're going to write the equation in point-slope form of the line with a slope of 5 that goes through 4, -3. So I'll start by saying y minus, and then I'm going to subtract the y value. So I'm going to subtract -3. Now, of course, we all know that when you subtract a negative, it's going to turn into a positive. So if I want to go ahead and write that as +3, I can. My slope is 5, and then I'm going to write parentheses, don't forget the parentheses, and then x minus the x value from my point, which is 4. So if they asked me to write it in point-slope form, I would be done. Typically, they're going to want you to go ahead and turn that into slope-intercept form, which is very easy. So my first step is to write it in point-slope form. My next step is to distribute the right side. So on this side, I'm going to distribute that 5. The left side is going to stay exactly the same. So this is going to be 5x minus 20. And then I'm going to add or subtract whatever the constant is with the y, which means I'm going to get rid of +3 by subtracting 3. And then my final step is that it's in slope-intercept form. So the 3 goes away, I get 5x minus 23. So this is our final end goal, because we know from here I could start my point at -23 on the y and use my slope of 5 to go up 5 over 1, etc. Let's try another. This has a slope of 1/2 going through the point -2, 6. So y minus my y value equals my slope, and then parenthesis x minus my x value. I'm going to go ahead and call that +2 because minus a negative made it plus. Then I'm going to distribute. So the 1/2 times x is 1/2 x. 1/2 times 2. Remember, when we multiply with fractions, I would take 2 times 1, so multiply by the numerator, which is 2, and then divide by the denominator, which 2 divided by 2 is 1. So again, 2 times 1, which is 2, divided by 2, which is 1. That's where you do that very easily without your calculator. Then I'm going to add or subtract to get y by itself. So in this case, I'll add 6. And that gives me y equals 1/2 x plus 7. And now it's very easy for me to use that to graph. Here's one like that for you to try before we try a little bit more complicated question. So press pause, try this question, and then press play to check your work. So I'm going to do y minus my y value. Y is -4, so I'm going to add 4, so minus a negative means +4. My slope is -3, and then x minus 1, x minus the x value. Again, if you need to label those x1, y1, you sure can. Then I'm going to distribute the right side, so that's -3x, and be careful with this one, negative times a negative is a +3, and then I'm going to subtract 4 to get y all by itself, and that gives me, minus 1. So y equals -3x minus 1, or I could have put plus -1. Now I want to do some of these with you as well. This is like the next step. This one, notice we are not given the slope in the equation, but we're given 2 points. And we know that we can find the slope using the slope formula. So now I'm going to start with the slope formula, which means I'm going to take y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So in our case, that, remember, you can use either one for x1, y1, x2, y2. So I'm going to find that m equals 1 minus -1, which means +1, and then 3 minus 5. That gives me positive 2 on the top, and 3 minus 5 is negative 2 on the bottom, so my slope is negative 1. And now I'm going to do point slope, and from here it's all the stuff we know how to do. So I'm going to say y minus, and then this is where you make a choice. I can choose the first value for x1, y1, or I can choose to use the 3, 1 as my point. It doesn't matter, just because I call this x1, y1 doesn't mean I have to use it, but I'll go ahead and use it. So y minus negative 1 would be y plus 1. My slope I just found is negative 1, and then x minus 5. Then of course I'm going to distribute. So I have y plus 1 equals negative x plus 5, so I've distributed that negative. And then of course I'm going to add or subtract, which means I'm going to subtract 1 to get y by itself. And then I get y equals negative x plus 4. That last step was to turn it into slope-intercept form. Now, if I would have chosen the other point, I would have still gotten the exact same answer. I'll go ahead and do it with you on this one. So y minus the y value equals the slope, x minus the x value. That would give me negative x plus 3. I would add 1 to each side and get y equals negative x plus 4. So same thing, pick whichever point you're most comfortable with. Next one, same idea. I'm going to start with the slope. So y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. This one's going to be a little bit tricky because on the top I get 5, but on the bottom I get 0. And so we know the slope is undefined. So let's talk about what that means. Remember, undefined meant that my line goes straight up and down like this. So looking at the points 3, negative 4 and 3, 1, then my answer would be that x equals 3. So I didn't have to do all of the steps on this one, and notice again both of my x values are 3. So sometimes that's going to happen when your two x values are the same, you'll get an x equals that number. When your two y values are the same, you'll get a line like this, and it'll be y equals whatever number they have in common. Here's one for you to try. This one's easier than the last one. Go ahead and go through the whole process, find the slope, point slope form, slope intercept form, and then press play to check your work. So first I'm going to find the slope, negative 1 minus 2 over 0 minus 6, which gives me negative 3 over negative 6, or positive 1/2. So I get y minus, I'm going to use my first point, my y value of 2 equals 1/2, x minus my x value of 6. Distribute the 1/2. Remember, when I take minus 6 times 1/2, it's minus 6 times 1, which is negative 6, divided by 2, which is negative 3. And then I'll add 2 to each side and get y equals 1/2 x minus 1. And that's my final answer.